The video of Sam Carling speaking to Parliament about Jehovah's Witnesses begins at 3 minutes 5 of this video. The following is how to find that, and more information.
Sam Carling.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. And may I begin by again welcoming this bill. It will deliver so much for my constituents in relation to protecting people from crime and enabling tough action on antisocial behaviour, including areas which have for too long been labelled low level and ignored, like the illegal and off-road bikes, which my constituents so often raise with me. And it will introduce mandatory reporting for child sexual abuse, one of the key recommendations from the independent inquiry into child sexual abuse, which I'll abbreviate as IICSA for the remainder of this speech. That is a long overdue measure and one long called for by our Labour Home Secretary and the Prime Minister personally. However, I remain concerned that the government is not going far enough on the issue of mandatory reporting, and that is why I have laid 3 amendments to the bill on that subject, numbered 10, 11 and 22, which my speech today will focus on. These are not intended to change government policy, quite the opposite. These amendments are intended to deliver the government's stated policy, to implement the IICSA recommendations relevant to the Home Office in full. The Home Secretary stated in January that this was the government's intention. And she reaffirmed that just yesterday, actually, in response to my question on her statement, with a firm yes, after I asked if it remained her policy to implement them in full. But there are 3 significant gaps in our plans to implement Recommendation 13 on mandatory reporting, where the bill is not delivering what IICSA recommended. With these gaps, I am concerned that the duty to report will be ineffective in some of the settings where it is most needed, religious groups in particular, and I will use the example of the Jehovah's Witnesses, the religious group which I grew up in, to illustrate how and why. They have a deep cultural distrust of secular authorities, and that leads to a culture of dealing with everything internally, as happens in a lot of different religious groups, including child sexual abuse, and reporting nothing to the police. Furthermore, their internal processes for doing so are atrocious. For example, there's something called the two-witness rule, which means they take no action on any report of wrongdoing unless there are two witnesses to it. There are never two witnesses to child sexual abuse. I give this context to highlight why the mandatory duty to report must be absolutely watertight, as IICSA recommended, to prevent people in leadership organisations, or in leadership of organisations like this, from avoiding it. So I'll come to the three gaps in turn. Firstly, there are no criminal sanctions if you don't comply with the duty. I understand that the government is proposing professional sanctions, i.e. a referral to the Disclosure and Barring Service and to relevant professional regulators, but that's not actually on the face of the bill, and it would only apply to a fraction of people under the duty. It would not, for example, do much in religious settings, where so many of the failings are happening and where the duty would, if constructed properly, immensely help to protect children. IICSA were clear that failure to comply should be a criminal offence. My Amendment 10 makes this the case and proposes a fine as the appropriate sanction, which is in line with best practice overseas. Because many other countries, France, Australia, parts of Canada and so on, have introduced mandatory reporting, and many have done so with criminal sanctions of this kind. And while the government will likely say that criminal sanctions could have a chilling effect that stops people going into professions that work with children, the international evidence clearly shows that this does not happen. In the Australian state of Victoria, for example, and Professor Ben Matthews has done some extensive research on mandatory reporting laws and their efficacy, which I thoroughly encourage the Minister to ask officials to examine. The second gap relates to who actually comes under the duty to report. IICSA recommended that it should apply to anyone working, firstly, in regulated activities with children under the Safeguarding and Vulnerable Groups Act 2006. The bill uses that criterion tick. But IICSA then also recommends that it should apply to anyone in a position of trust over a child as defined by the Sexual Offences Act 2003. And that's what the bill does not include. My Amendment 22 would make it so. At the moment, the bill instead creates a list of relevant activities in Part 2 of Schedule 8, which replicates about 90% of what is in the Sexual Offences Act. But that missing 10% is critical. It includes sports coaches and teachers, for a start, which our schedule does not. And to go back to my example, the Sexual Offences Act includes a very effective definition of religious leaders in Section 22A. We have put a definition of religious leaders into our schedule in this bill, but it requires them to have, and I quote, regular unsupervised contact with children to be subject to the duty. That will allow virtually any religious leader, be they paid clergy or a volunteer elder, like in the Jehovah's Witnesses, to escape the duty, as very few have regular unsupervised contact with children, despite being in a very significant position of power and influence. And I personally happen to know at least one person who actually was sexually abused as a child in that organisation. They went to speak to religious elders about it in the presence of their parents and not unsupervised, and they were advised that to go to the police would mean bringing reproach on God's name. So no report was made, either by the victim, their family, or those religious elders. This is commonplace. And under the bill as currently drafted, there's no sanction for that. The elders aren't mandated reporters, and even if they were, the proposed offence under Clause 73 around stopping someone else from making a report, which I very much welcome for the record, only applies to other mandated reporters. So if someone pressures a victim, or their parents for example, not to make a report, that won't be illegal. So that offence needs to be broadened too, and I know the NSPCC are calling for the government to consider a broader offence of concealing child sexual abuse, which I urge the government to give serious consideration to, and I may give some more detail on that later if there's time.
Will you give way?
I will give way.
Cameron Thomas.
I thank the Honourable Member for giving way. He's making very important points about, particularly about the Jehovah's Witness cult. And one of the methods that they use to ensure that issues like this don't escape from the organisation itself is the act of disfellowship, where an individual is threatened by being disfellowshipped all communication with their own family. And I wonder if he'll go a little further into recognising that too. Thank you.
Sam Carling.
I absolutely will, and I very much thank the Honourable Member for that intervention. I'm very pleased that other Honourable Members in the House are aware of that issue. It's something I am trying to do some work on separately. I think it is certainly relevant to what I'm discussing here. Just to give the House a little more context on that, what that essentially means is if that organisation decides that someone has committed a serious sin, it can essentially tell all of their family and friends to cut them off permanently. The same applies if they just choose to leave the religion. But very rarely is that applied to perpetrators of crimes, and more often to victims that report them. And it is an enormous problem that has to be dealt with, and I look forward to engaging with the Honourable Member further on that. So, the Australian Royal Commission, which investigated this organisation's handling of abuse cases, as I highlighted at second reading, found that allegations had been documented by religious elders against 1,006 individuals in Australia alone, and not a single one was reported to police. So we must tighten up this definition and make sure it includes religious leaders. The government could do that by amending our definition in item 17 of part 2 of schedule 4, and also adding a further item to the list in relation to sports professionals to deal with that point as well. But the much neater and stronger legislative solution would be to just do what IICSA said and refer to the Sexual Offences Act 2003 and the definition therein. And as I said, my Amendment 22 proposes to do this. The third problem relates to what actually triggers the duty to report. IICSA recommend that it should apply in 3 cases. 1. A mandated reporter is told by a child or perpetrator that abuse has taken place. 2. They see it happening. Or 3. They observe recognised indicators of child sexual abuse, which can range from something like a child that is pregnant or has a sexually transmitted infection to other more subjective indicators. Our bill scores 2 out of 3. It does not include the third point, recognised indicators, also referred to as reasonable suspicion. And overwhelmingly, children do not report abuse that is being done to them at the time it is happening. Those that do report tend to do so years after it happens and when it is far too late to protect them, and far too late in many cases to catch the perpetrator and stop them harming other children. And that Australian Royal Commission, again in 2015, found that the average time for someone to disclose child sexual abuse was 22 years after it happened. So including reasonable suspicion is critical here. And that is what my Amendment 11 does. And given the potentially subjective judgments needed in that case, Amendment 11 does exempt the case of recognised indicators from criminal sanctions for non-compliance, which is what IICSA recommended too. The government may be of the view that including recognised indicators and making my proposed changes to include positions of trust more thoroughly will lead to a flood of additional reports that will overwhelm the system with false leads that prevent real cases of abuse being tackled. These are very, very reasonable concerns, and I hear them. But again, we must look to the international examples where this just has not taken place. In Australia, there was an increase in cases after they brought in robust mandatory reporting laws, but the system adapted and coped, and existing screening processes were reworked to remove false reports more effectively. And notably, the number of substantiated reports made doubled, meaning that twice as many sexually abused children were being identified. This is making a huge difference. And we don't even have to go international to see that fears about floods of reports just do not materialise. We just have to go to Northern Ireland, which already has mandatory reporting for all adults, with criminal sanctions for non-compliance, as part of their broader legislation requiring the reporting of arrestable offences to police. And there's no overwhelming flood of reports going on over there. I urge the government to take these problems seriously. As I said at the outset, the Home Secretary has reaffirmed several times that government policy is to implement IICSA's recommendations which fall under the remit of the Home Office in full. I know the government will need to reflect on these issues in detail, so I'm not going to press these amendments to votes today should the Minister not accept them, but colleagues in the other place, I'm aware, will press these amendments. A number of honourable members have signed them, with 12 signatures on Amendment 22, for example, so there is a significant fear that without these changes, the proposed mandatory reporting duty is too weak. We all want to get this right, but the impact assessment on a very similar version in the last government's criminal justice bill was damning, predicting only a very small increase in the number of reports. If I may just conclude very briefly by returning to what I mentioned earlier around a potential offence for concealing child sexual abuse. I looked at how to put this in as an amendment to broaden discussion, but it was very difficult to phrase in the correct way. Essentially, the NSPCC have highlighted a number of cases where they are arguing our bill does not go far enough to cover the multitude of ways which reports of abuse can be concealed and could allow people who intentionally conceal this crime to slip through the net. IICSA found a number of cases where they believed that actually a lack of reporting had bordered on concealment. And as a couple of examples, we can imagine that Clause 73, as currently drafted, means that a senior leader of an organisation who chooses to simply move on an employee they suspect of committing child sexual abuse, rather than ensuring they are reported to the authorities, may not be caught under the offence around preventing someone else from reporting, if their actions do not actively prevent or deter that reporting explicitly. And other actions could include communities, institutions or authorities destroying evidence of historical child sexual abuse to prevent it being reinvestigated, or in some other way hampering or impinging upon investigations that are taking place, or someone burying evidence of child sexual abuse after it's been reported to the authorities so it can't be properly investigated. And this bill provides us with a really strong opportunity, I hope, to deal with some of those issues, and I hope the government will look at that as the bill moves through the other place. So thank you very much to Andrew Speaker for calling me, to the House for listening to that, and I very much hope that the government will continue to work and look at these issues in more detail so that we can find an acceptable solution.